Ladies and gentlemen, it is now 7:30 in the Central Time Zone. Thank you all for joining us. We have people from not the Central Time Zone today. Today, I hope you have all had the opportunity to rewatch Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. And, sometimes we give you a hard homework assignment, something that is dark or sad or just could put you in a bad mood. But this week we try to lift your spirits. And so with me tonight, we have just an incredibly a special mensch, shall we say, a mensch of cinema. And
It's a niche and a niche.
yes, and so Ben, it's so wonderful to see you, and I haven't seen you since we had our Kovacs Award back, which was
Yeah,
you know
trailing on the trail of John Cleese for 3 days.
really really amazing. So I
Yeah,
just wanted to tell you something before we get into the film we're going to be talking about. So I had an email from Rick Warland, who teaches film at SMU, and he gets the newsletter. He said, "Oh my God, is that the Ben Modell you're going to have? I mean, I've heard an awful lot about him. Is he going to be here?" And he said, "Damn, I can't make it, but man, that is just amazing."
wow.
And then so I said to him, he used to be the department chair. He, knows people and get things done. I said, "So, wouldn't it be a great idea if we had a silent film weekend at SMU?"
Hmm.
And he said, "Let me work on that."
That
And
sounds great.
maybe not this year, but next year. Wouldn't that just be really a wonderful thing that we could do? And of course,
Yeah.
we wouldn't think about having something like that without your presence
Oh,
here.
well, thank you. You
Uh,
could do it. You could do it before next year. We could do it virtually. I do virtual events, streaming out of our living room all the time. So, you could certainly do it. Just have it hosted by SMU.
that would be really
Yeah.
cool and wonderful things to do. So, for those who don't know Ben, Ben has like two things for he is like a mensch of cinema. One is that probably is nobody who does more and better accompaniments to silent films than he does. He literally travels around the country, around the world, um, with his with performing to silent films, and he also is an archivist. And we first met when talking about the great work of Ernie Kovacs. And I think there is not a single episode from any show that Ben does not know and can talk about at the drop of a hat.
Hmm.
And while I am a great appreciator of him, I don't have that the kind of memory and the deep internal database
Yeah.
of that you do, which comes from this great affection. So first of all, Ben, is there anything else you want me to say, or you want to say about what you do that I didn't mention, other than you
Sure.
teach, right?
Sure. I teach a course on silent film at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. It's not as much of a history class as it is a tracing the arc of the development of visual storytelling in the silent film era, from the early teens to the end of the era, where gradually more and more and more is left to the audience to fill in and assemble in their heads, and then sound comes in and just completely throws that out the window. I
Mm.
am also a DVD label. I inadvertently became one in 2013. We've got 23 titles in release right now. Under Crank Productions. If you look for Under Crank Productions, just go to undercrankproductions.com. Our DVDs are available on all platforms, from the TCM shop
Mm.
to Amazon, all the Amazons around the planet, deep discount, et cetera, et cetera. And the label is basically, it's fan funded. We crowdfund through Kickstarter and work either with film collectors or film archives to get films that you've never heard of, but you should,
Mm.
from film cans to film fans. So all sorts of stuff that has just fallen through the cracks because Buster Keaton isn't in it, but which people saw and loved while they were waiting for the next Harold Lloyd picture to come out,
Mhm.
has is now available. And the other big thing is the silent comedy watch party. Before we officially started the Zoom,
Yeah.
I was saying that I never stopped performing, because a few days after the shutdown, I pivoted and figured out a way to do what I do out of our living room, but online on a weekly basis. And so we've been at it for a little more than a year now. And because that works, um, I'm able to present silent films and live accompany them for museums and theaters and schools all over the planet. I did a show for a bunch of four classes of fourth graders
Mm.
at a school here in New York City a couple of weeks ago, where I had done it in person for years. And so I knew what it must have sounded like in the classroom.
Mm.
But, it's just me and Mona, my wife, here in our living room. And we're running, 1 week with Buster Keaton. And it's usually just, they're, practically falling out of their chairs. But I just had to imagine it. But doing this, figuring out how to do this virtually, has meant that I've been able to continue to share silent film with live music, while we're all stuck in our Zoom boxes.
So, so if somebody wanted to find out when these opportunities were and if there are ones that one could see, I know that everybody who is on the Zoom call right now would love to experience these. Where could we find?
Okay, well, it's funny you should ask. The show streams live on YouTube every Sunday afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern time. That's two for those of you in the Lone Star State. One if you're in Idaho, and it's noon in California. But there's a young woman who's a huge Buster Keaton fan in Kanazawa, Japan, who wakes up at 4 o'clock in the morning so she can watch the show live. There's somebody in Moscow who watches. We hear from people all over the planet, but we also leave the shows up on archived on YouTube. So there's 51 episodes of the Silent Comedy Watch Party, plus the pilot that we did, that you can go back and watch. And there are people who've written to me and like, I can't believe I just found this. I'm catching up. They're like binge watching and getting caught up. But there's people who watch from all over the planet. Australia. We hear from somebody just wrote to me. There's a couple in Maui who never misses the show.
So, Ben, what are we doing this week? This
Sunday we're showing The Tramp with Charlie Chaplin.
Oh.
And we are showing Luck of the Foolish with Harry Langdon. Oh. And it's me and my friend Steve Massa, who I bring in remotely through some very good TV switching software called Mimo Live. And sometimes we have guests from outside. But Steve and I take turns in talking about the film, and I'll play for the films live right here from our living room. And the following week on April 11th, our guest will be Bruno Mesdag, who is the head of the digital film collection at the Cinematheque in Brussels. So we'll be showing a few films, very rare films that only exist at the Cinematheque in Brussels, and Bruno will be joining us. So every Sunday afternoon.
So let's get to Modern Times. Can you remember the first time you saw Modern Times and how?
Absolutely. It is, to borrow a line from a very famous Ernie Kovacs sketch, it is etched into my memory forever. It says, "Oh, it happened yesterday." Yeah, I was 9 years old, and the film was in a re-release in 1972. And that's the poster you see behind me, which I won on eBay a long time ago, and you can easily win stuff like that. But I was a huge Charlie Chaplin fan from the time I was a toddler, according to my folks. And the only way to see more silent movies, if you lived way out in the suburbs like I did, was to wait for public television to show it, or it would be shown on one of the independent stations as kids programming or filler. But there were, and this is I think around the time of Chaplin's getting his much deserved and overdue Oscar, that some of the films were being reissued in the theaters. And so I went to the Larchmont Playhouse in my town and saw Modern Times. And I'd seen Charlie Chaplin films on our Zenith black and white TV. I'd seen them maybe in some libraries in 16 millimeter prints. But I'd never seen this film. This is 1972, so this is way before, VHS even, where if you wanted to see something, it was running at 2 o'clock in the morning, and that was the only time you were going to get to see Animal Crackers. You just stayed up because that was it.
Right. Or you had to go to a city that had a repertory theater.
Right, which I probably should have I don't know why. When I was in high school, I didn't come into the New York City more. Yeah. I just didn't. But I remember this film. There were a few things about it that just hit me really hard. One of them was, first of all, I'm seeing it in a regular movie theater, so it's a sharp studio 35 millimeter print.
Mm.
I'm assuming it's 72. I'm assuming xenon lamp projection, not carbon arc, but it's this bright, sharp. There's just the gray tones and the sharpness, and there's a blue quality I remember about it. I don't know which one. There was a Crazy Cat cartoon that preceded it for some reason. No, even the cartoon nuts I know don't know which one was circulated with it, but because it was re-released by Columbia, so it was one of the Charles Mintz color Crazy Cats, and then the film starts, and it's the shot of that shot of the clock, and that music, which in 1936, that whole tone scale, which is um, signified modernism and technology and the future. I mean, there's a James P. Johnson piece of stride piano called "You've Got to Be Modernistic," and it's full of those whole tone chords. But when you hear that now, it's like, oh God, the monster is coming. So, so here is this sharp, bright image, and uh, and it was just it was such a different, and it is a different film in so many ways. There's the moments where there are sound effects. Just I
Yes.
vividly remember the feeding machine sequence and the sound effects of the machine malfunctioning, and when on the factory floor, when there are explosions and sounds, and the factory owner talking to Charlie from the TV screen.
Yeah.
And I remember that more than the nonsense gibberish he sings at the end. It was such a striking, and he's it's in so many different. There's so many ways that the film is different. It's like, um,
And
uh,
this is so far, just to state the obvious, because some people may not know this, but this is what, 1936,
6,
and sound comes in
29.
yeah, 1929.
Yeah.
This is pretty far away. Would you consider this like the last classic of silent cinema?
Um, for in the U.S., yeah, sound took over in Asian countries much later.
Mhm.
There are Ozu films from the mid 30s and
Uh-huh.
other Japanese performers, and part of that wasn't so much the technology as it was the 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 tradition in Japan and China and Korea was that films had a narrator called a benshi, and there might be music, but there would be a performer who would stand next to the screen and narrate the film and do the different voices of the different characters and tell the story along with it. And the audiences were very connected to these benshi. And this was where sound film got it took a while because people didn't want to give this up. There are still people who perform this. There's a guy named Ichiro Karaoke who has been to the U.S. a couple times. I've seen him perform. I don't understand Japanese, but it was just getting to see him do his thing was really amazing. And there are people who still do it. But in the U.S., yeah, probably 36. I mean, even City Lights, which was released in 31,
Yeah.
was still silent film was a distant memory for as far as the industry and a lot of people were concerned. So to make another silent film 5 years later was a huge stretch. But he was Charlie Chaplin; he could do whatever he wanted.
Yeah. And just sort of state the obvious, it's really hard to have the Tramp character work with sound. And I think he so deeply understood that. And
Yeah, he definitely did, and you know because you love him, and you just in The Great Dictator when he opens his mouth with that clipped
yeah,
upper sort of classy British accent, like okay, he's a Jewish barber in his fake German country, and he sounds like that. Oh, it's Charlie Chaplin. You just sort of go, you kind of roll with it, but it's it's um it's both the silence, but there's another part of silent film itself that only exists in silent film that we don't know if this was what he was hoping to avoid giving up. Um, but it's something that completely goes out the window, which is the use of speed. Um, this is something I've been fascinated with for the last 10 years, and nobody noticed this. Nobody sort of picked up on it for a very long time. Is the basic fact that silent film is shown faster,
Right.
but it's shot slower,
Right.
and it's not a mistake. Or otherwise, Charlie would have shot Modern Times and City Lights at 24 frames per second. But the idea from the beginning was that the performers and filmmakers knew the film was being shown faster in the theaters. They couldn't do anything about it because the theater owners weren't going to run the film slower and have fewer shows and sell fewer tickets. The filmmakers weren't going to crank faster to catch up because that's more money on them. And what the comedians especially found that they could do is you could create gags that weren't funny in real life but became bits of comedy when sped up, not because of the speed, like the way Richard Lester would undercrank
Right.
with just about anything he does, where the joke is the speed.
Yeah.
But there's a you can play with logic and consequence and laws of physics and gravity in a way that you can't because of the reality of sound film. And in Great Dictator, there are a few sequences where Charlie undercranks. So there's a moment where one of the stormtroopers gets hit on the head, and Charlie and he do this dance up and down the sidewalk. Well, that's undercranked a little bit. You can post dub it later, so you don't really notice it. But all the really iconic physical bits of business in Dictator are slightly undercranked. And I think that Charlie's character only existed in that slightly sped up universe of silent film, and it wasn't just giving him a voice. So much of his character is this amazing dexterity and split-second timing that he had, but that's an illusion that gets created through the speed of a silent film.
And just to be clear, the term undercrank refers to cranking the camera at a slower pace,
Yeah.
over time, slower.
Yeah.
Range.
Right, and it was used for many decades for car chases and stuff like that.
Right.
And you can't really detect it because of post dubbing. There are some places where you see it and you're aware that it's being done. And I don't know what they called it in the silent era. It was so commonplace and ubiquitous, nobody ever talked about it. And I think I now know of 2 interviews where film actors said this is what we were doing, and that's it.
And the thing is, when you look at films now that sometimes undercrank it, like students will do this sometimes, it's like it automatically gets you a laugh. It's like it puts you in this non-real universe, and it
Yeah.
puts you into this place where you can sort of pay attention to the motion and the movement, and
Yeah.
it becomes more prominent, which is the kind of universe that Chaplin kind of lives in, the Tramp character.
Yeah.
And like you say, as opposed to the Great Dictator, when he's sort of speaking, even though that's unique in its own way.
Yeah.
So given that, let's talk about the him actually singing, because that is the only bit of synchronous sound in this whole thing.
Yeah.
And when you saw it the first time in 1971, was that?
2.
72, excuse me.
Yeah. Yeah.
The year after I graduated high school.
Yeah.
So in 1972, what did you think when you saw him speak? When you saw him?
I don't really remember. Like I said, I was so much more struck by everything else that was done with sound. Just the use of the sound effects sparingly, not for cartoony effects, and not everything had a sound effect. Yeah, I don't really remember. It's strange that's a part of the film that I mean, I'm sure I had some kind of reaction, but just the feeding machine malfunctioning just is seared into my brain. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's certain visuals when you think of the film. There's maybe 6 or 7 or 8 like images that just are sort of planted there. I just want to say that your experience of seeing that like really beautiful on a big screen is slightly different but similar, because I watched these films in the 70s in 16 millimeter projectors in classrooms at college.
Yeah.
And they were bad prints, and they just did not look very good. And later, when you could see them like in a real theater and with good sound system and good projection, it's like watching something completely new.
Oh yeah.
particularly with foreign films, like you could never read the subtitles because the titles, if something was white behind it, you just lost those
Yeah.
lines for a little bit, and it was really problematic. And they were relatively hard to find. I mean, it was different than this universe we're living now. So one of the things in watching this again, there are two things that were interesting that remind me of. One is the sort of reference to Metropolis in so many places.
Yeah.
Just the idea of the look of the machine and the cranking of those things, but also like the boss on the TV
Oh, yeah.
seemed like a direct reflection off of Metropolis.
Yeah.
So while the films have a very different tone to them, their sense about the mechanization of the world is very similar.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the other thing is the candy scene from I Love Lucy. I mean, how can
Oh,
you see that the scene in the beginning when he's trying to work those wrenches and not like have that image of Lucy and Ethel
yeah.
trying to get those pieces of candy?
Yeah.
They're just so clear. So yeah. So what are the other things about this film that you like that sort of stick with you?
Well, there's just so many great sequences in it.
Mhm.
It's kind of hard to pick. I think one of the things that I really like about the film is that while pretty much all of the other films he makes or has made look like they're either set in Dickensian England, although in the U.S., or it's still tinged with that wherever the setting is, and this every almost all of his films, there's this gentle setting of the scene. Here we are, and then here, and we discover Charlie is taking a little walk somewhere, like in The Kid, or in the beginning of when we first meet him in The Vagabond, or in The Tramp, or or he's at work or something like that. But it's just this gentle thing, and um, in modern times, there's all this energy in this industry, and he borrows a cinematic device from the Russians by dissolving from the sheep to, to the people going into the factory. And then when we discover Chaplin, he is hard at work with with the span, bang, 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 bang. And the fun thing, I took the footage of him on the assembly line and slowed it down to cranking speed, which is 16 frames per second. You see he's missing a lot of the bolts, but
Oh,
you
really?
don't notice it. It's happening so fast.
Uh-huh.
It doesn't really you don't know, but he knew that. And no one's going to notice that I'm missing half of the bolts. But we discover him hard at work, in a factory surrounded by other people who are hard at work, um, and it's just a very different feel. He's in modern. I mean, not only is it's called Modern Times, but he's in. I mean, that Charlie is in. It's 1930. It was shot in 1935,
Mhm.
but between that and his co-star Paulette Goddard, who has a much more contemporary kind of look to her. Um,
Yeah.
he doesn't. It's not Edna Purviance 2.0, another shy blonde woman sitting off in a corner while he runs around and does everything. He's got a partner,
Yes.
which is really rare, and almost you never see that with Keaton. The woman is along for the ride, and she is
Yeah.
actually helping out, and you see that in Charlie Chase comedies. They're teamed together, um, but for Chaplin to have a you know
An active
an
participant.
active participant
Yeah.
it's really unusual, and there's just the energy and the social satire that he touches on in a lot of other films and a lot of sequences. It's present through almost throughout the film.
So, you talked about the musical chords at the very beginning.
Yeah,
Do you want to talk about the music in general from the film? Because the music and the song at the end,
yeah,
which is very powerful, and the song he sings. I mean, music is very sort of key to this. And
yeah,
we talk about Keaton as a writer, as a performer, as a director. but the music is so like really important here.
Yeah, it is because Chaplin wrote it, and I have a copy of the LP that I had also growing up. This is the one I had, but this was issued on United Artists Records.
Wow.
Several tracks from the film. What's interesting about them is that the sound effects that you hear in the film are not there. So
Hmm.
they had found some mix that didn't have the effects in it just yet. Um, yeah, Chaplin was very, once he, you know, in making City Lights in 1931, when the soundtrack was going to be recorded,
Hmm.
and everybody seeing the film could hear the same soundtrack, which is before sound comes in, it's really up to the local musicians and conductors to create the score. And you could create a score and send it out, you couldn't enforce it. Chaplin apparently was involved with the compilations of the scores for Gold Rush and the Circus, which used classical music and mood music and pop tunes. But it wasn't a score he wrote out. But starting with City Lights, he had this opportunity to create the score. And what's really interesting about the score for City Lights is that it's not like typical silent film scoring as it was in the 20s, which was a lot more not only pastiche, but it was more mirroring than it was supporting. So if you saw a sequence with a dog, you would have the orchestra would play the song "The Whistler and His Dog," or somebody had a theme. It would every time they entered a shot, you might hear it.
Hmm.
There's a lot more, but by today's standards, it's corny. Um, and uh, the score for City Lights is not like that at all. I had an opportunity a bunch of years ago to play the piano and celeste part with a symphony orchestra for City Lights for
Wow.
4 shows that were done in northern Norway that were conducted by Timothy Brock, who is the person who the Chaplin family since the late 90s has hired to restore and supervise all the scores. And go learn first of all, learning that score, which I thought I listened to the music from the film of City Lights. I thought, oh, I don't hear piano, so have a lot of rests written out, 89 bars of rest. It's constantly,
Hmm.
but going on the ride with that score, being someone who had been playing for films for 30 something years already, and knowing the film, and we weren't supposed to watch the film, but I would look up at the screen to see what was matching with what, and it just really struck me. As much as people credit is often given to, I think, Alfred Newman, who worked with Chaplin on that score.
Yeah.
um, it's so far from what film scoring was at the end of the silent film era. Some of the choices are very specific and unusual. Um, that I have to give Chaplin credit for just knowing what works for different scenes that he's in, and I think that just carried on over into modern times. He knew, and same thing. He couldn't read or write music, but he knew what he had in his head, and he knew what he wanted, and his sensibilities about what worked were absolutely right. And um,
So would he just sort of play a theme?
yeah, yeah, he would plunk
Sorry.
something out.
Sorry.
Um, he would plunk things out or hum things.
Uh-huh.
And David Raxon, who's probably best known for the score for Laura, speaking of scores where a theme comes back over and over,
Yes.
who was like 23 at the time, was hired to take this down and arrange do all the charts for this score, um, would transcribe things that he would write out. Um, about, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, I got a chance to meet Eric James. And Eric James was Chaplin's music supervisor in the 60s and 70s for the scores he was doing later.
Hmm.
And that's how they worked. And, Chaplin was very demanding, like he always was, a perfectionist and everything. But Eric James said that Charlie would have this notation system. He would write down first 4 notes, Mendelssohn's Sonata number 4 in B flat, next 4 notes, Beethoven's, and so he would remember little bits of that. That was his notation system.
Hmm.
And Eric said, "Do you want me to teach you how to. Oh no, 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 no. He was afraid it would mess up his process. But he would remember stuff like the main theme from The Kid is actually from Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony. And every once in a while, when it plays on classical radio, and it gets to that part of it, oh, that's the theme from The Kid that Chaplin lifted. Um, but he knew exactly what he wanted. And I think part of what the other part of what I think works about a lot of his melodies is how simple they are. Part of scoring film and scoring comedy is playing, and this is just my own philosophy, is playing music that's interesting enough to pay attention to, but not pretty enough to pay attention to, but not interesting enough to pull your attention away. So a lot of Chaplin's themes are, a basic chord will be, or so, a lot of the stuff in the factory is, and just up and down the scale. Um, uh, you know, it's just all the keys that are next to each other. There's a theme in City Lights. I mean, it's just going from a G all the way up to another one, but it's pretty and it's not too complicated, and you can watch the film and not get too distracted by it, and even smile. I mean, it's just keys that are next to sequences of keys that are next to each other. And that song was a theme written for the film. The lyrics are not by Charlie Chaplin. He often gets quoted for the lyrics to Smile. He didn't write them. And I know this partially, I'm reminded because, 15 years ago, a girl who was 8, I think at the time, a British young woman who's now in her 20s and has a singing career and stuff, had been introduced to Charlie Chaplin and his movies by her grandfather when he babysat for her. And she created this project to raise money for, I'm going to get it wrong, it's a youth hospice or something like that in England. And she dressed up as Charlie Chaplin, and her parents made this really nice video, and on it she sings Smile. Well, the company that owns the rights to the lyrics had her take it down. The Chaplin estate was okay, but it was the lyrics. So while they were stuck trying to work this out, I forget where I heard. I think it was a news story that sort of caught my radar, and I pulled out my keyboard and I knocked out a track for it, and I sent it to her. Said, use this while you're figuring this out. But the company called Bourne, spelled like Matthew Bourne and Company, which controls some of the stuff. They control the lyrics, which were written in the 50s by somebody else. But the melody is just, it's so like a lot of Chaplin's melodies. And there's one, the La Violatera, which is for the Flower Girls song, and Flower Sellers song, and the City Lights. It sounds like something he wrote, but it isn't. And there's a credit for it in the opening titles, but it's, I can't really remember how it goes, but it sounds like something he wrote.
So one thing you said there that stuck out to me, it's like you're not supposed to look at the film, and you took a peek at the film. Because
you're not supposed to pay attention to the music.
But you said you peeked up to.
Oh, look. Yes. No, because it's a full symphony orchestra. The harpist is next to me. There's timpani, 6 French horns, an entire reed section. I mean, it's everything. And Tim Brock is in the middle, and the orchestra spread all the way out from one side to the other, and I'm at the far end, and he's conducting, so he doesn't need a click track. He's Timothy Brock. He knows his film inside and out. He conducted in his sleep, and and you have to keep your eye on the stick, absolutely, to stay in sync so that you're all together. And on top of that, what was happening in rehearsal is that he would say to me, you're behind. And I'm like, I'm watching it, and I hear where from the bass drum and the basses. He said, yeah, but by the time the sound of the piano gets to the middle, it's behind. So you have to anticipate a little bit. He said, don't worry, it'll all match. Just watch the stick. Don't worry about what you're hearing the bass drum do.
Boy,
Yeah, so and there are parts of that score where it stops and starts over and over, this is the thing that I found fascinating, seeing it written out. So the sequence in City Lights where Charlie is the camera's inside a shop window and he sees a statue of a naked person, and then he sees something else next to it. He keeps walking back and forward, and the music stops and starts over and over, just like it's 2 beats over and over. But the way that's written, it's 2 notes and then a rest and a fermata, which is a little symbol that says don't do anything. So we're watching Tim Brock go ba da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 da. And so you can't look away.
Yeah.
But there are some parts of the thing where it's. So I could glance over and hope, but at the same time, a lot of those things, it's the same 3 or 4 chords over and over for 4 pages, like that hurry theme, and it goes on for 5 pages, and you can't lose where you are because you'll never find it again. And during the performance, he's not going to say, letter D, you just have to. So, but I would glance up and say, oh, that's what that is. Okay.
I heard that on this film, Alfred Newman and Chaplin kind of parted ways at a certain point. What do you know about that?
On City Lights or on Modern Times?
Modern Times.
Yeah, I think I read something about that. I read through the chapter in David Robinson's book. Yeah, I forget what it was over, but Chaplin, knew what he wanted and was very exacting, and had his temper or personality. And I know Raxon got fired right, after a week and a half, and they worked something out, and he continued to come back. But there was a point where during the recording session, I think, that Newman stormed out, and the guy who was either the other arranger or somebody like that, I'm blanking on his name, finished the recording. But he was Charlie Chaplin. He had been in that kind of a position for a long time and was used to getting his way, and just he knew what he wanted.
It sounds like in some ways he was like Stanley Kubrick, and he wanted exactly what he wanted and will go to whatever lengths necessary to get that.
Yeah.
And if you didn't want to work with him, it was going to be a problem. You couldn't sort of put up with that.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard similar stories about, Jerry Lewis, and but these are people who, there is something about getting a huge amount of success at a young age and that kind of popularity, and it can go to your head, and
like Orson Welles.
Yeah, I mean there's lots of examples of that, and to feel like, oh, I'm 21, I have all these. I mean, I'm sure it's part of why Eddie Murphy disappeared for a little while. It just took him a while to recover from it, because you're on top. I mean, it happens to anybody who's gotten that much public adulation and success at a young age. That's just temperament. But in terms of the score and the making of the film, I mean, he knew what he wanted. He had a great team of people around him as well, and he surrounded himself with a great ensemble of people who were from the silent film era. Mm-hmm. One of the things I liked in watching some of the sequences at cranking speed, which actually the shooting records survive for City Lights and Modern Times, so we know exactly what the cranking speeds were. But there's a moment where Tiny Sanford, who's in tons of silent comedies, he's holding on to Charlie, and when Charlie Chaplin is like going berserk and he's about to go down the chute, and you don't notice this until you really watch it in real time, and he's holding Charlie with one hand, and Tiny Sanford yells, "He's crazy," or something like that. And the reason Charlie goes down this chute is that Tiny Sanford lets go of Charlie's leg so he can yell with both hands.
Oh, no.
And you don't notice it because you're just it's so fast, and the universe of silent film is just like you. As long as everybody on screen believes what's going on, you'll go with
Right.
it.
Right.
But I'd never realized. Oh, he let go. This man could be killed and crushed in all the gears. But no, they don't hear me, so I better yell with two hands.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point, that if the characters all believe what's in there, then it works
This
in
is
the universe.
Yeah, this is a big part of silent film, and um, it changes when sound comes in because it's much more grounded in reality. And again, this is the 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 latitude you have to play with logic, consequence, and laws of nature and physics. Uh, it's for comedians or action people like Doug Fairbanks or Tom Mix,
Yeah.
it's like a kid in a candy store. And then as soon as sound comes in, I think really that was what. Uh, it's just a theory, but I think that's what Chaplin was loath to give up
Yeah.
the most because, um, you know, uh, at least with Dictator, um, if you're gonna speak and go into reality, that subject was a good reason to do it.
It's like it's room tone. It's like once you have room tone, like camera feels the sense of the room, you're tied into a sense of reality. And in a sense, silent films work under the same laws of physics of cartoons, because cartoons
Yes.
have no sync sound. There's no room tone. There's only sound effects and music and voice from the characters. And
Yeah.
and so they have the sign of, they work in your head the same kind of way. The laws of physics don't always work in a cartoon. It's like
Yeah. They're not supposed to. Yeah.
right, right.
Yeah.
But as soon as you bring in a microphone that feels the world, it's like we have this different expectation of the universe.
Oh, absolutely. And you hear the body weight and you see the body weight. If you ever watch Feet First, which is Harold Lloyd's sound remake
Oh my.
of Safety Last,
Yes.
um,
Uh,
you hear the traffic noise and you hear him yell, "Help, help," and his body thuds against the building. And it's just, it's not funny anymore. I mean, it's further exacerbated by the fact that instead of Bill Struthers, the human fly, climbing up the side of being his ally inside the building,
yeah.
that person is now played by Stepin Fetchit, which it just makes it even harder to watch. But this whole the whole it's real. This is a man hanging off the side of a building in absolute peril, and um, it just doesn't work anymore. Laurel and Hardy were lucky in that they were already slowing things down, and some of their later shorts. One of my favorites is Wrong Again, where they just sort of sit there and look at each other. What was that? What's going on here? And they're just taking their time. And so when sound comes in, it was the perfect match for them. But silent film isn't movies with no sound. It's a completely different universe, and you you can't just speed up the camera, and it's not that it's a mistake and everything should be real time. But this is something that I figured out like 10 years ago, and I gave my first talk on it at a Chaplin conference. And David Robinson and David Shepard came up to me afterwards, and they were like, "How did we miss this all these years?" You know, it was like, "Oh, it's it was kind of like figuring out that all magicians don't possess these amazing powers, that it's actually sleight of hand."
Really?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Don't tell anybody. But it's like, oh, there's this thing that when you can, in the speed up of silent film, little pauses that you put in disappear, and you can make things look much more dangerous. Just you really in making a silent movie, you can think of yourself as being in a cartoon and say, how far can I take this without injuring my without injuring myself?
You can, in a sense, be more expressionistic. And
Oh yeah, you can really. I mean, this is why you know. the point I make when I show my students Keaton's The Goat and Sherlock Jr., it's just like they're practically, it's just this shy of the insanity of Un Chien Andalou. I mean, it's just nothing makes sense. Nothing is grounded in reality. But you can get it. You can absolutely get away with it. And so all the things that Chaplin does in modern times with dancing up and down this huge factory set.
Right.
Um, uh, I mean, absolutely everything, in the film is something that could only be done in silent film. And I felt the same way going on the ride with City Lights. It was like he was saying, "You idiots! Look what you just gave, look what you've given out. You can't all the iconic sequences from City Lights are things that could only happen in a silent film, like the boxing match."
Yeah. And this does it again, it comes at a time when most everything else coming out is sound.
Yeah.
And it just seems like an anomaly. I mean, if you would have seen it in the year that it came out, you would have felt really weird watching a silent movie. And
Yeah.
did anybody write about that, about like how it was received at the time because of that?
I I don't. It may have been, but I just don't know. I mean, it was a huge hit.
Yeah.
But again, he was Charlie Chaplin. He could do, whatever he wanted. He had complete creative control and made a film when he came up with an idea for it. Um, but it was even making City Lights as a silent picture in 31 was, silent film was almost instantly ridiculed as an archaic antique when sound comes in. There are films from the early and mid 30s that are like shorts that Warner Brothers would put out, making fun of silent movies, where they would take a film made by, because they bought the Vitagraph company, a film from 1912, and you run a 1912 film that should be running at 18 or 20 frames per second. You run it at 24. You put in corny narration,
Uh-huh.
and silent movies were just sort of this dopey antique of yesteryear almost immediately. So to continue with the language was really it was bold, but at the same time, I think that in his own universe, he was like, this is what, this is this is the way I make pictures.
So, have you read anything about what Chaplin was trying to say in this film? Because, I mean, one could look at this through a political lens of how machines are affecting them, affecting the world, and people who are sort of thrown out, and the evil of the bosses of the world, and what has been written about this that you've heard, or what?
Um, I'm sorry, I don't really know.
That's
I don't
okay.
read a lot of film theory and stuff like that. But it's, he may not have. I've read that he wasn't intentionally trying to make a point about this sort of thing, but I'm sure it was on his mind. This is, after the depression is still wearing on,
Yes.
uh, I don't know if the New Deal has kicked in at this point, but they're trying to bring the country back.
Right.
Um, but throughout his films, there are little moments of social satire
Yeah.
sprinkled here and there. I mean, going even into the films he makes in 1915 for SNA, and all the way through. Almost all of his films have a moment where he is sitting at a table eating food, usually with Albert Austin, and there's all this. There's always like satire on table manners and indigestion.
Hmm.
And there's a moment in a short called Work from 1915 when he and another man are hired to come in as construction workers and put up wallpaper. And a woman sees them and goes, "Oh my goodness, my jewelry." And right in front of them, takes all of her jewelry and locks it in a safe. And Charlie looks at her and does the same thing. So he and his coworker take their pocket watches and put them in his coat pocket and lock it. And it's just sort of this jab at class-based society. But
Right.
there are little moments like that all the way through. And he may have thought, well, this is going to be my last silent picture. I mean, we don't really. I don't know that we really know, but it is. There's just so much more of it. Uh, and there's stuff you can retroactively read into it, like the thing with the communist flag.
Yeah.
This isn't one, but
Right. Right. Well,
um,
yeah, it's black. We don't know because it's black and white.
yeah, well, yeah.
Uh, So let's talk about the song that he sings.
Hmm.
First, from a musical standpoint, it. What do you think about it? And that sort of gibberish that sort of sounds Italian. When watching it again, it sort of reminded me of like in The Godfather when they're at one of those weddings. It's kind of like what the band would be playing. The da 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 da.
Yeah, it does sound like Nino Rota composed it.
Yeah.
It's an old vaudeville tune or an old song called Titina
Uh-huh.
that has lyrics. So it had been around for a long time, but like a lot of Chaplin's own melodies, there's a lot of his stuff that he writes that sounds either very Italian
Uh-huh.
or or sounds a little Jewish. Um, but it's a song that already existed, and he just wrote those nonsense lyrics um, to it. But that's sort of Puccini. I mean, that's one of the things. I remember Timothy Brock in the rehearsals. There were some moments when we were playing the love theme, the orchestra was playing the love theme, and he would say quasi Puccini. You know, um, so it was a great way of getting around everything.
Mhm.
You know, and you must speak. You know, like and so what's he going to say? So at least it's gibberish, and you can in the same way, like I was talking about with the melodies, it's like you're still watching his pantomime.
Yeah.
And he's doing the whole performance and telling the
Right.
story of what the song is. So the lyrics don't get in the way. He doesn't have to worry about his vocal performance or anything like that. Um, and there's the device where he's written everything on his cuffs, which I've seen in another film. Um, uh, and yeah, so it's just a very clever way of getting around what's he going to do, and
Yeah.
it's staged very carefully on the way in. Anyway, the transition is is very smooth. The version that we know, the end is kind of abrupt, but there's another. Somebody I know turned up a laser disc of a release that from Japan that has another verse at the end of the song where the song ends, and it's a much cleaner transition from the 24 frames per second back to 16.
Mm.
Um, this the part of the story he's pantomiming is something about going to a jeweler who he's doing this sort of Jewish stereotype movements, and maybe that's why it got removed. But it was done very carefully. He was very, very careful. But it is interesting that out of all the things he picked an existing piece that sounds like something he would have written.
And the scene that's just before that when he's serving the duck or whatever, and like holding it, just such a joy to watch, and like all of the extras in that room kind of moving that around and then hooking it on it's just such a beautiful scene.
Yeah, yeah. It's just it shows that with he could work with giant groups of people as well as doing these little small things.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, yeah, and he had great assistants working with him. So yeah, it's just the idea of it is the fact that he had so many amazing ideas, one after another, um, inside this film that's 100 minutes, I think, is phenomenal.
And it's kind of like these sections. It's like it's not a traditional script that goes from here to there and sort of builds. They're just like, well, we got the stuff, in the factory, and then getting her in jail, and then
Yeah,
it's sort of like a series of two reelers kind of put
right.
together.
Yeah, I've read that it was thought of as it's so. I mean, but so many of his films are episodic, and a lot of his films were he would improvise on set and film it, and then scenes would develop out of that, and then they would see where it went, and he would watch it, and then go back and reshoot it and recast it or something like that. Um, um, so it is I think one of the other things I like about it is I guess I kind of have a thing for nonlinear narrative. I like Amarcord.
Yes.
Uh,
Love
and
Packard.
and some of my favorite Laurel and Hardy films are things like Busybodies, where there's no story.
Yeah.
It's Stan and Ollie working in a lumber mill for two reels. There's still something holding the whole thing together. Um, some of Jerry Lewis's films are, The Ladies' Man is like that, and The Bellboy, but in Tati, who really sort of
Yeah.
took the nonlinear narrative. And I think Jerry Lewis, and had Ernie Kovacs not died, he was planning on making a film out of his Eugene character in the same vein.
Yeah.
It started this whole thing. But Modern Times, like a lot of very late silent films, is sort of this tone poem about an aspect of life, which is kind of where not all silent film was like this, but at the end of the silent film era, there are so many films that are just about this one subject. You have Sunrise and The Crowd,
Yeah.
and Langdon makes Heart Trouble. He makes what's the one that's so surreal? I'm blanking on the name of it. Three's a Crowd,
Yeah.
and Keaton makes Steamboat Bill Jr., but Steamboat Bill Jr. is also about the relationship between Buster's character and his father, which he's never dealt with. Chaplin's The Circus is all about what does it mean to be funny, and Lloyd's Speedy has a simple plot which is dispensed with for 44 minutes in the middle. You don't know it because the crafting of the film is so brilliant that you don't notice the plot is gone for 4 reels. But Modern Times is sort of this meditation on what does it mean to be alive in this second industrial age, or whatever you want to call the 30s. And what do you do with this character who's basically, until this point, kind of been rooted in a Dickensian or mid or late Victorian, almost British sort of setting, transplanted to America, and then stick him in a factory and give him a partner for a change. I like going on the ride as long as it's structured nicely and it's got a point to it. But yeah, I don't know why I like.
And that's great performance. I mean, I think all
Yeah.
things are so based on the performance. And mentioning Eugene and Kovacs,
Yeah.
I mean, thinking of that, it's there's no synchronous sound. It's like there's no room tone, and it kind of operates in that same space.
You mean Eugene?
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We've recently turned up some typed script pages and pages and pages of notes that Ernie had written. Um, I had always suspected, because he mentions it in an interview and talks about the film in great detail. He talks about the opening sequence and down to what lens he wants to use, and that Alec Guinness, in his mind, would play Eugene. But it is almost in this vacuum, uh, and I have to imagine that Kovacs was influenced by seeing Mon Oncle,
Yeah.
because that's 58, and then the Bellboy is 60,
Mhm.
and Ernie is planning Eugene in 60. He does it for the first time in 57, but remakes it for his specials for ABC in 61, which I think he did as a pilot to show that this
To
could
raise
work.
money for the film.
He actually had one of his specials already slotted for November of 61, but he bumps it to December and shoots the Eugene show, which instead of his usual Thursday 10:30 time slot following the Untouchables, it's broadcast on the Friday of Thanksgiving weekend, preempting the Flintstones, which was enjoying its second year. It's a big primetime thing. So he somehow got that time slot, changed his schedule. This is just a theory, but I think that his idea was to do that sort of as a pilot to show that this could be something. And
I'm just
somewhere in another universe, Ernie got to make that film with Alec Guinness. Somewhere.
so last question. So what do you consider the greatest work of silent cinema?
Ha!
Because
Oh,
you have such a knowledge, a very intimate sense of.
I always get that question, and
I'm
I
sorry.
never have an answer. I never have an answer. It's either that or what's your favorite film to play to, and I don't. It's always for me. I really have become more of a programmer,
Mhm.
and what I do now is, I think, uh, is an extension of what happened, something that I grew up with, which is showing films to other people. I grew up in Larchmont, which is the town where Walter Kerr lived.
Uh-huh.
And when I was 12, I got a copy of his book, The Silent Clowns.
I,
Oh,
I
just
have
happen
a
to
copy
have a,
of that,
I happen to have a
and I,
copy of it right here.
and I know where Larchmont is. I have a copy in my bookshelf right over there.
Yeah. So my folks heard that Walter Kerr had a 16 millimeter film collection, and I wrote him a letter. And 4 days later, he called me, and for the next through middle school and high school, certainly, a bunch of times a year, I would take my folks would drive me over. I'd ride my bicycle over, and he would say, "What do you want to see?"
Uh,
And so I got to film school, having seen all of Chaplin's films, all of Keaton's films, all of Harry Langdon's films. I saw the Raymond Griffith films, Harold Lloyd, everything.
wow.
Um, I
That's
saw my
amazing.
first exposure to Safety Last was a French print of Just the Climb, that where Walter Kerr is in the back of the room with his reel-to-reel tape recorder with soundtracks, calling out in translations of the titles, or in the middle of Sherlock Jr. That's where Keaton broke his neck.
Wait,
Um,
that is just
so
amazing thing to know. Wow. What a way to go.
Yeah, and so here's somebody who showed me movies, and so for me, uh, it's always about for me it's about the audience. What do when people it drives I'm sure it drives venues crazy. Well, what do you want to show? And I'm like, I don't know, what have you shown people already? How well versed are your patrons with silent film? Is there something where there's a link? We found a nice, when I was out in Dallas, we showed The Racket because it was produced. We showed this at the Texas Theater. It was produced. The film was produced by Howard Hughes,
Yeah.
so there was a link there. So it's a what can we show people that might be interesting? Um, I might get. I don't know that I get sick of 1 week, but it's what I show elementary school kids
Mm.
because it's always new to them. And so I don't know that I have a favorite. I don't sit around watching silent movies or the new Blu-ray of whatever. I'm too busy getting other things out to people. I found this wormhole of crowdfunding and manufacture on demand,
Mm.
almost a decade ago, that is helping get things like Alice Howell comedies and now Edward Everett Horton silent comedies out to the people who want to see them.
Well, I look forward to the day when I can stop into your house like you went to Walter Kerr's,
Ha
and
ha ha.
you can show me some things from your collection. By the way, for me, Sunrise is to me the ultimate sense of what cinema language could be as a silent movie.
Oh no, absolutely. That's like if you don't want to if you want to show a silent movie to somebody who's never seen one and they're not up for a comedy, you show them Sunrise.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really, yeah, it's one of those late silents where you watch and you think, man, if sound had just held off, the Warner Brothers had just held off 5 more years, where could cinema have gone?
Yeah.
It's just such an amazing film.
Yes, so much of the universe stopped when the microphones showed up, and the
And the
aesthetics of film language.
Yeah, and the cameras had to run at the same speed as the projectors,
Right.
and
Yeah.
the process changed. You had to hold your breath,
Yeah.
and you couldn't make a sound, and you had to memorize your lines, and the vibe on the sets was totally different.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we should all watch Singing in the Rain to remember that era.
Oh
Um,
yes, and watch my YouTube video where I found that there's a sequence from it that is a shot-for-shot remake from a sequence in The Cameraman.
oh,
Yeah, when he's the singing, if you
yeah.
take this, if you take the number "Singing in the Rain," just the number out, it's a shot-for-shot remake of a moment in The Cameraman that I discovered. I lined the two things up next to each other, and it's amazing. The kiss in the rain on the apartment steps and
Uh,
walking down. There's a tracking shot.
uh.
It's the same. It's the same thing. So look for that also.
Well, Ben, this hour has gone by like poof,
Mm,
like the magic of cinema. It is
yeah.
such an incredible joy. And thank you so much. It's been really wonderful. And gosh, I hope I can see you sometime soon.
Yeah, I hope I can see you larger and in 3 dimensions, and same for everybody else who is on the Zoom or watching on Facebook or wherever you're watching. Um, yeah, I hope we can all be in the same space again sometime.